Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Susan Edwards, Executive Director and CEO of the Frist Center. Thank you for joining us for Food for Thought, presented in partnership with Vanderbilt's Office of Community, Neighborhood, and Government Relations. We would like to thank their staff, Gail Carr-Williams, Chandra Allison, Midori Lockett, and Carol Mackey, for all they've done to make this program possible. Thank you very much. We also like to thank Metro Arts Commission, the Tennessee Arts Commission, and the National Endowment for the Arts for their continued operating support. World War I in American Art is on view in the Ingram Gallery through January 21st, 2018. We hope you've taken the time, or will, to see the exhibition. And while you're here, please stop in the upper level galleries for Nick Cave Feet after today's program, or anytime you can come back. We remind you that food and drink, which are welcome in this auditorium, are not allowed in the galleries, so please finish your lunch here if you could. Today's panel focuses on the exhibition World War I in American Art and investigates the impact of war on health. We have distinguished panelists. I'd like to introduce our Lisa Boudreau, who's the Senior Curator of Military History for the Tennessee State Museum. She has also served as a freelance historical consultant for the American Battle Monuments Commission in Paris, France, Vice President of Education and Collections for the National World War I Museum in Kansas City, Missouri, and is research historian for the U.S. Army Sargent General's Medical History Office in Washington, D.C. She is a distinguished scholar, and Dr. Boudreau has published works which include Bodies of War, World War I, and the Politics of Commemoration in America, 1919 to 1933, and Answering the Call, the U.S. Army Nurse Corps, 1917 to 1919. We also welcome Kenneth McLeish, who's Assistant Professor of Medicine, Health, and Society and Anthropology at Vanderbilt University. Kenneth McLeish studies how war, broadly considered, takes shape in the everyday lives of people whose job it is to produce it, U.S. military service members and their families and communities. His book, Making War, Everyday Life at Fort Hood, was recently published by Princeton University Press. Today also, Trinita Kennedy, curator at the Frist Center, who is responsible for World War I and American art and many other projects, as our members know, will be our third panelist. So I'm going to turn this over now to Trinita, who will lead this off. Thank you, Trinita.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our panel today about World War I and American art. The exhibition, which is the most ambitious ever mounted about the response of American artists to the Great War, is timed to coincide with the centennial of the United States entry into the conflict. It presents 140 works of art, organized roughly according to the chronological arc of the war and its aftermath. The works range in date from 1914 to 1945. In addition, there are 4 contemporary works of art that show how the war continues to linger. I hope you will take the opportunity to see the exhibition today if you have not already. The main topics of our discussion here will be war in the body, medicine, and remembrance. The panel follows closely on the heels of our national holiday honoring our country's war veterans, a time when these very issues are top of mind. November 11th, of course, is also Armistice Day, when the fighting of World War I finally came to an end in 1918. Our panelists, Lisa Boudreau of the Tennessee State Museum and Ken McLeish of Vanderbilt University, are researchers focused on war. The books that they have published are listed in the handout, and I highly recommend them. Both Lisa and Ken are brilliant thinkers and beautiful writers, and I am grateful to them for their willingness to share their unique insights that they bring to our exhibition. So our discussion today will be structured around works of art, most of which are on view in World War I in American art. But to set up our conversation, Ken would like to begin with a quote from the German philosopher Walter Benjamin about the trauma caused by the unprecedented destruction of World War I.
Thanks, Trinita, and thank you for that very generous introduction as well. And thanks also to the Frist and to all of you for being here today. I've really been looking forward to this conversation. I wanted to kick things off today with this quotation from Walter Benjamin, who was a German Jewish philosopher and critic who did most of his writing in the period between World War I and World War II. And so he was someone who had lived through the destruction of the First World War and was also, at the time that he did a lot of his work, dismayed by the rise of fascism in 1930s Germany. He wrote in this essay called "The Storyteller" that he wrote during that time, kind of reflecting on the devastation of war and what it meant for what had seemed like modern progress to produce this tremendous amount of destruction. He wrote what I thought was a fitting kind of meditation for us to kick off this discussion. So as it says here on the slide, was it not noticeable at the end of the war that men returned from the battlefield grown silent, not richer, but poorer in communicable experience? For never has experience been contradicted more thoroughly than strategic experience by tactical warfare, economic experience by inflation, bodily experience by mechanical warfare, moral experience by those in power. A generation that had gone to school on a horse-drawn streetcar now stood under the open sky, in a countryside in which nothing remained unchanged but the clouds, and beneath these clouds, in a field of force of destructive torrents and explosions, was the tiny, fragile human body. And I paired this quote with this photograph of the Battle of the Somme, and these are, I believe, British soldiers in a trench in the midst of the Battle of the Somme, which was the scene of one of many deadly scenes of, one of many scenes of deadly and protracted trench warfare fighting. I paired it with this particular image because it's such a vivid illustration of these conditions of war making that Benjamin is talking about. And a good opportunity, I think, for us to think about the relationship between how warfighting technology directly impacted people's bodily experience of what it meant to be at war. And we can see in this photograph a number of the things that he is talking about. So this is French farmland that has been reduced by high explosive artillery fire to what essentially just looks like a moonscape. There's very little recognizable about it as a natural landscape, and there's this sense that hopefully we'll have a chance to come back to through some of the other artworks of the natural world just being, the natural world itself being utterly devastated by war-making technology, and human beings, in this case these British soldiers, literally sort of living like burrowing creatures in these holes in the earth in their protective trenches. Off in the background there's this kind of dilapidated shape that is a tank that has been disabled either by being blown up or driving into a trench or a tank trap. And World War I was also the advent of tank warfare. And we can see with this object in the background sort of a reminder of both the kind of terrible promise of technology, but also its frailty and potential failings. And so all of that is just to sort of situate these experiences of the body and technology and then war-related injury and experience at this moment of epochal change, where what seemed like progress was also incredibly barbaric and brutal to human life, where progress itself might be something that we would want to call into question. The idea, as Benjamin says, that this is something that is political because it represents a betrayal or exploitation of the folks whose lives and bodies are actually on the line being affected. It represents potentially a betrayal of those folks or an objectification of those folks by the people in power who are making decisions about how to wage war and how to and when to fight and when to end the fighting. and that in the midst of this, it's the human body, so that remains consistent, or that is sort of the one thing that we have to hang on to as a point of reference, both as the thing that is doing the fighting, the thing that's getting hurt and being injured, and then the thing that is also the target of healing and the target of remembrance, as I think we're going to have the opportunity to talk about as we go ahead.
All right, so this is one of the earliest works in the exhibition. It dates from 1914, and it's a political cartoon by an artist named John Sloan, who is probably more famous today for his paintings. And he made this cartoon for a leftist magazine based in Greenwich Village, and it's called After the War, A Medal and Maybe a Job. And John Sloan was a pacifist and a socialist, and he was very much against the United States entering the war. I think it's quite important that already in 1914 we have artists who recognize that soldiers will have to sacrifice quite a lot if the U.S. enters the war.
Yeah, and so Elisa and I were chatting as we were getting started, and she said, "Oh yeah, that Sloan cartoon is really gruesome," I had not thought about the fact that we would be looking at this while we were eating lunch, and so I apologize for the fact that this is my choice that we include this particular image, but I wanted to include it for exactly the reason that Trinita just mentioned, that. One, I think it's a very vivid sign and reminder to us that whether we're talking about World War I, whether we're talking about contemporary conflicts, that the body of the injured soldier is this profoundly political symbol that plays into discussions about how and when to go to war. And one of the things that this actually reminded me of was sort of something else that was going on at the time in the early 1900s and in the sort of the lead up to the U.S.'s entry into the First World War, which was a tremendous anxiety about what to do with the injured or disabled soldier in general. So not only was there this sort of caution or skepticism about who exactly was going to pay the price for going into war, there was also a lot of sort of much more widespread anxiety about how will our society function if we send off vast numbers of people to fight and they come back to be potential burdens to the state, or they come back unable to perform the kinds of labor or the kinds of gendered expectations that we expect of our young men to be heads of household and breadwinners and fathers and things like that. And in fact, medicine played a very important role even at this stage, because the idea that advances in surgical techniques and rehabilitative medicine that became really honed over the course of the war, but that had begun to be pioneered as the U.S. was contemplating its entry into the war. These medical advances based on healing bodies made the idea of entering war and exposing American soldiers to violence more palatable, because it suggested that the human cost of waging war could be reduced. And I think, so I appreciate this image as kind of a caution against that, the idea that these decisions are still potentially exploitative, still involve decisions about asking others to place their lives on the line. But that also medicine is something that is directly implicated in the way that we talk explicitly or implicitly about the costs of war and what it means to go to war, because it informs our sense of what it means for folks to be injured in war and what the stakes of that are.
So the United States enters the war in April of 1917. And once it does so, the government starts issuing a lot of posters in order to raise an army. So you'll see in the exhibition quite a few enlistment posters encouraging young men, initially between the ages of 21 and 31, to enlist. And this is actually one of my favorite of these posters. This is by a female designer named Bray, And it reads, "Enlist, on which side of the window are you?" And this is from the first year of the war. Do you want to talk about it, or? Yes.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. Reiterate your comments, Ken. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here today, and I hope I can contribute something worthwhile to your afternoon, to your interest in this topic. I love this poster as well. I think this is wonderful. Very quickly, to reiterate what has already been said, April 6, 1917, Woodrow Wilson goes to Congress, and he asks for a declaration of war against Germany. And, of course, he receives this, and within just a few weeks, by May or June, the Selective Service Act became a reality, and we needed troops to add the numbers to the military to send them overseas. And so this Laura Bray poster, I think, does an excellent job at that. It's a very clever use of light and dark. It asks the question, it tries to elicit an emotional response from this man standing there in his suit. There's almost a class dynamic going on. He's looking on the other side. He's in the dark, he's in the shadow, and he's looking out into the light where he sees very strong, virile men, courageous men. They're, of course, in the lighter side of the window, and he's sort of ambivalent, you know, should I go, should I not go? And I think she speaks to this, and she's trying to instill pride in those who are maybe thinking, well, it's not really for me, I don't know if I should do this or not. So she makes great use of shadows, I think, and putting him sort of in the dark. And then once he decides to enlist, of course, he'll be sort of in the light, so to speak. So it's an excellent way to galvanize public support and to mobilize men for the military. Thank
you. And of course, it also it also is an image that really relies on our culturally ingrained notions of masculinity as something that is associated with war, right? So this is that in kind of doing all these compelling aesthetic maneuvers that you just described, Lisa, like there is very much a sort of appeal to manhood, the idea that that serving in the military is something that that constitutes you as a man in a culturally recognizable and socially appropriate way, and by implication suggesting that that not taking up service, that staying on this side of the window does not represent the sort of fulfillment of the promise of manhood. And this idea of the kind of the gendered character of military service, which I know some of the other images are going to speak to as well, this is also something that very much persists in the present, even though we think of our, we probably think of ourselves 100 years later having much more sort of progressive views of both gender inclusivity in military settings and in society as a whole, but the kind of appeal to manhood and the idea that that there's a certain kind of masculinity that in American society you can only get access to through military participation is something that that we continue to see being exercised, and that at least from my perspective as an anthropologist, alerts us to something important about how it is that we think about war and how it is that we think about gender in our society, sort of who's allowed to have access to this special sort of prestige, and how it is that these ideas about gender are mobilized for the purposes of war making.
So in the enlistment poster, we were looking at a man and his involvement in war in a very kind of pensive moment. Here is one where we see the war from a mother's point of view. This is a painting by Gifford Beall, which shows the town of Newburgh-on-Hudson, which is about 60 miles north of New York City. It's actually quite near to West Point. And so that's the Hudson River there in the background. And we see a small town essentially being evacuated of its men as they march off to both the train and the boat by the waterfront. I know that this painting was of particular interest to Lisa, who has thought a lot about kind of the sacrifice of mothers. And also, I think this one immediately called to mind the World War I song, I didn't raise my son to be a soldier, right?
Actually, you did. I don't know if you know that, but mothers then didn't know that, but they quickly realized that. They certainly did raise their boy to be a soldier. I really like this one. I think that Beall gives this sentimental sense to this. It's not just another patriotic parade. There is a great use he has great use of light here. I didn't realize that his parents had a summer home here, and that was why he chose Newburgh. Great town, actually. But yes, once again, you see this shadowy side where the mother's being left behind with the child, and this great use of light leaving her behind. And once again, you see the soldiers, the strong, the heroic, going off on their adventure in the light, of course. And we know that they're about to leave because we see the smoke of the train in the center of the scene here. Women, I was going to say this. This separation, I think, of women being left behind is an important one for this period, because women as mothers and as wives, particularly as mothers, have to give their boy up, and it's part of being considered being a citizen in the United States. That's a role that mothers quickly realized that was going to be one of their key responsibilities in a democratic nation, is that you're going to be asked to raise and then give up your son to the United States. And in a democracy, this is what's expected. And it becomes a very important part of the history of the story of World War I. There's a term called Republican motherhood. And at this time, you have to remember that motherhood and apple pie, mothers were at the pinnacle of this was the high water mark for motherhood during this period and into the 20s. And they certainly played this up years later. In 1917, the Gold Star Mother movement got started, and throughout the whole 1920s, mothers lobbied to go overseas, and they became a very strong political force in this country. But at this period, there's still some innocence here being shown as they watch the men go off. And I just think it's a very poignant scene, and I just love his use of color and light here. Thanks.
Kind of continuing to think about the role of women in World War I, we have several posters that address women. These were both produced by the YWCA, and on the left we have women going to work in an armaments factory. And then on the right we have a telephone operator working on the front. You can see the soldiers behind. So there were about 300 American women who worked in France. They were bilingual women who worked to serve the army as telephone operators. And it's a really fascinating story, actually. The women were required to wear army uniforms, as we actually see here. But after the war, they weren't considered official members of the Army, and it was only in 1978, 60 years after the end of the war, that they received veterans' benefits. So, Lisa, I know that you've done some research on the role of the YWCA during World War I.
I think this is a great pair of posters right here. I think what they scream is if we're going to make it through this war, we're going to need women. We're going to need them working outside the home, and we're going to need them on the home front and overseas to support men in a whole new way. So roughly 30,000 women eventually volunteered to be clerks and telephone operators and nurses. And I think that this, artistically speaking, I think Baker and Underwood's interpretation here is really a good contrast, because on the left side, if you look at the women that are shown here, they sort of have a really tough look to them. There's sort of a socialist, kind of Stalinist. I'm getting out of my field here. I should stick to history. But you know, it's a really tough woman, a tough kind of a woman, and she's wearing this really tough military uniform. And then on the right, you see a softer, more feminine female, and she's kind of sitting back in her nice little outfit, and she's got a little dress on, and you know, she just looks softer and more feminine. So in a way, they're kind of appealing to a variety of women, saying, you know, we've got something for everybody here, you know, so hey, come and join us, we need you. And I think women were, it was the moment. They were ready to step out to, it was sort of an exploitation, I think. But then again, you know, this wartime, everybody's being exploited. So, yeah, I think these are great posters, yeah.
Yeah, and just to sort of tag on to that comment about exploitation, I mean, I think one of the ways that we can think about what we're seeing here between this image and the painting, the Baker painting, and then, or excuse me, the Gifford Beall painting, and then the Enlist poster, is also just the way that you know, that our ideas about what kinds of work of war making are appropriate to whom, our ideas about gender are reproduced within war, but they're also maybe sort of, yeah, exploited or instrumentalized. So as the military would go on to do in subsequent conflicts, sort of appealing to the broader desire of American women to be increasingly independent or to enter the workforce in domains that have been closed to them. That there's this interesting tension between sort of new opportunities and the sort of endurance of these stereotypes.
So I'm very grateful to Lisa for bringing these photographs to our attention. And they are related to Vanderbilt University's involvement in World War I. And this is something I think that you've been researching for the Tennessee State Museum.
Yes, I have to pitch a plug here for the Tennessee State Museum. This is the point where I do that. So, but seriously, we are very excited to be building a brand new museum over on Jefferson Street. And one of the exhibitions that we're going to be opening with, since it will be next year in 2018, is a Centennial World War I exhibit. And in addition to our regular gallery, which will showcase World War I, World War II, Civil Wars, other wars, we're going to have a special dedicated room just for the Centennial of World War I. And I was so excited when I arrived here 3 years ago in Nashville to explore the collections and to discover that we really do have a wonderful collection of World War I artifacts. And so just for today, I thought it would be appropriate to showcase two of the key features of the exhibit. And on your left is Dr. Albert Wynn Harris, Jr., and he married, some of you may know, Con Overton Thompson of Glenlevin. And he went to France with Unit S of the Vanderbilt Medical Unit. And we have his collection in the museum. We have his trunk and all his surgical instruments and his uniform, and it's just very exciting that when I discovered him, I was so pleased. So here on the right is actually the Army Nurse Corps, the hospital unit that went over to France from Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt was extremely instrumental, key in this area as far as supporting the war effort. They had an ambulance unit, that they sponsored, and also the whole hospital unit. Because when the United States first entered the war, we did not have sufficient medical services, hospitals ready to go. So we relied on the Red Cross, and extremely relied on the Red Cross to help us get through those initial first months. So as you recall, the British are already fighting over there, and they've got their hospital units, but they need to be freed up so that they can do more. So the United States sent over 6 base hospital units, and Vanderbilt followed along very closely on that, over to France to free up the British hospitals. And so I think we can be very proud of the fact. And also Gertrude Whitney Vanderbilt, I believe, Vanderbilt Whitney. Okay. I remember reading about her driving through the front lines in a, I was going to say in a Jeep, but that would not be right. Right, in a Model 8 Ford, that's probably what, or maybe a Packard. But yes, the Vanderbilt family was very key in this war, and we're so proud to have this part of the exhibit to show. So thank you. Oh, can I just add one more thing too? When we started out, the Army Nurse Corps had only 400 nurses, and by the end of the war, we had 21,000 nurses geared up and ready to go. So I had jotted down a little thought here, and perhaps Ken will elaborate on that throughout the program. Lessons learned on prior wars had to be relearned, and I think this is key, one of the key things, to be prepared. And so at that point on, we made sure that we had the medical units ready to go. And we learned an awful lot from the First World War in terms of medical care. So thanks.
All right, so one of the great discoveries of the exhibition is a large group of watercolors now held by the Smithsonian by the artist Claggett Wilson. And you'll see, I think, 14 watercolors in the exhibition in all by him. And 12 of them deal with the time that the artist spent in the Battle of Belleau Wood, which was one of the largest battles of the war. It lasted almost an entire month in June of 1918. And Claggett Wilson really makes an effort to teach those of us who weren't there what it was like to experience it. And this is an incredibly kind of shocking image of a runner. So this is a man who was charged with carrying messages from one end of the battlefield to the other. And it was an extremely dangerous job, and you can see that right here in the watercolor. I know that this is one that interested you a lot, Ken.
Yeah, so I'm racking up the gory pictures, I guess. So again, my apologies. This is, I just find this picture and the other, we're going to look at a couple other Claggett Wilson paintings too, just so compelling. And one of the things that really grabs me about them are the titles, which, if anyone has been to the exhibit, you may have taken note of this. So the full title of this painting is Runner through the Barrage, Bois de Belleau, Chateau Thierry sector, his arm shot away, his mind gone. And they really, I mean, they almost have the sound of sort of like modernist poetry or something like that. And it's something that's echoed in, well, again, I should say I'm an anthropologist. I'm not an historian or a curator or an expert in art. But it's really one of the things that leaps out at me about this image is the sort of the modernist quality of the image, the almost sort of like cubist quality of how the runner's face is depicted. but then like softened by the watercolors and these this sort of interesting melding of, I don't know, like a face that looks almost skeletal or robotic, and then this a very sort of sketchy and impressionistic natural environment that this figure is moving through. And this is one of the images in this exhibit that made me think of that Walter Benjamin quote of the human body moving through a dramatically altered natural landscape. And here we see that that sense of juxtaposition and change also kind of registered both in the body of the runner himself and his missing arm, his arm that's been shot away by enemy gunfire, but also in the landscape. So all these fallen trees all around him, and we can see the kind of split ends of the broken tree trunks and limbs, which ironically resemble the hands, or the hand that the runner is now missing. And so we can see sort of this kind of miming of damage to the human form and the natural world being reflected back at one another, and understand this natural order as something that is both being disrupted and perhaps also constitutes its own set of harms. Like there, so it's we might perhaps it also looks as though those splintered ends of the tree trunks are sort of grasping at this runner as he makes his way through this dangerous terrain. And so the sense of kind of what's natural, what kind of order of the world can be relied upon has literally been shot to pieces. And then finally, I just as to foreshadow something that I'm sure we're going to talk about more in a little bit, the latter part of the title, his arm shot away, his mind gone. And this too is an echo of that quote from Benjamin, and this idea of the kind of, so he's carrying a message, but the expression on his face suggests to us that he has seen or experienced things that he will not be able to communicate. But also, ironically or poignantly or powerfully, we do get to experience some semblance of that because of these kind of dramatic and adventurous aesthetic decisions that Wilson makes in this painting, and I'll have more to say about this in a couple of the other ones too. But the way that the painting sort of confronts us with the sense of physical injury and psychological trauma is something that is really hard to relate to or communicate, but then does it by showing those things to us and inviting us to think about them and inviting us to imagine the challenges faced by those afflicted on them, but also kind of drawing us in and allowing us to imagine.
All right, another American artist who saw the war firsthand was George M. Harding, and he was an official war artist for the American government. So he was part of a group of 8 artists known as the AEF 8. And here we see a drawing called Cleaning Out Bosch Machine Gun Nest. So Bosch is a slang term for German. And here we see this extremely frightening tank up above a trench. And the tank, as Ken mentioned earlier, is one of the new weapons of war that was invented by the French and the British. And here we see it being used against the Germans. Do you want to talk a little bit more about it?
Yeah, sure. Please go.
To me, when I looked at this, first of all, it's just so scary, just isn't it? So strikingly frightening, especially when you look at the soldiers down in the German soldiers down in the foxhole in the tank above their heads. And I think what this speaks to me is of the new machinery of war and this mechanization being used either for good or for evil, in the sense that motorized ambulances, for example, were key to survival and recovery on the beneficial side, but on the alternative, we see the evil that the machinery of war, this menacing look of the troops, and their very survival, and it's just Notice too, this is a really minor point, but notice too on their helmets, the camouflage, the dazzle camouflage. This was used quite a bit, not only for their helmets, but also for ships and for tanks and guns. And it's an interesting detail, I think, on this as well. But I'm not sure how to interpret that artistically, but please go ahead.
No, and I was also really struck by this image for the same reason, the way that it offers this really like vivid, dynamic depiction. Like the elements in this picture really look like they're in motion of these two key new instruments of war, the tank and the machine gun, which was also had been used in a couple of earlier conflicts, particularly colonial conflicts. But World War I was its first really significant mass use, and the first place where it was used by both sides of a conflict on a large scale. And so we see, and not to put too fine a point on it, but we see these two new technologies, these two sort of marvels of modern innovation turned against one another, as they were turned against one another throughout the entire war. Along with a few other, so there's barbed wire. That was also a relatively new innovation that was a really important technical detail of the World War I landscape. But then just an additional point about this that again is sort of there in the title, cleaning out a Bosch machine gun nest. So like Trinita mentioned, like Bosch was a slang term that reminds us of the dehumanization of the enemy that is in many ways a kind of endemic feature of war. Again, even in modern and ostensibly enlightened wars, or wars that are fought for more humane purposes, dehumanization of the enemy, both through this term and the idea, essentially the implication of the enemy as vermin or pests, right? Something to be cleaned out or disposed of, which suggests a kind of sense of alienation from the enemy's humanity that's given material force through these new war-making tools. But something that also really strikes me about this, that you also mentioned, Lisa, is the fact that, and it's especially, I mean, this actual image is pretty small, right? It's like 8 by 10. It's quite small. But sitting down here at the bottom of it, the sense of menace that it creates is just even more heightened than what you get from looking at the original image itself. But even there, in the smaller image, one of the things that really grabbed me was, okay, so so Harding is there with, he's on the battlefield with American troops, and it really made me wonder what compelled him to represent this scene in this way, because a huge part of what we see in this scene is the terror of the German troops. The fact that they're being utterly loomed over and overwhelmed and dominated by American force. And perhaps this is just a sort of exciting or propagandistic image. It's an image about crushing or annihilating the enemy. But we might also think about it as potentially a sort of sympathetic or identifying image. The idea that this horrific landscape of war making was something that despite there being two different sides, everyone was kind of all in it together, and maybe arguably equally dehumanized by these tools and techniques of making war that had been let loose. Or it might also just be a reminder that when we produce an image of war violence, a lot is determined by the caption that you attach to it. That maybe we don't know whether this is an anti-war image or a pro-war image, whether this is a pro-U.S. image or a pro-German image, without the caption, or that freed of that caption, it could come to sort of serve a lot of different purposes, which I think is also maybe a useful thing to think about.
So throughout the exhibition, we find over and over again that artists are telling us about the new weapons of war. And one of the novelties of World War I is the extensive use of chemical warfare. And this here is the painting that we open the exhibition with. It's John Singer Sargent's Gassed. And this is a scene that the painter himself witnessed. It's the aftermath of a mustard gas attack. These are British soldiers who are victims of a German attack. And here they are receiving treatment, again in a field in France. Lisa, I know that this is a painting of particular interest to you.
Thanks, Janita. Yeah, I don't know. How many of you were here for the talk that we had on Sargent by Richard Ormond on gas? Did anybody? Okay. Well, you missed a really, really good presentation because to me, years ago, I remember seeing this painting at the Imperial War Museum, and I always wondered, well, you know, what is it about? I've seen photographs of the very same thing, but this painting to me is just so striking, and you want to be sure to see it here in the exhibit. We're very fortunate to have it here. I think in addition to the obvious ghastliness of Gast, it's the history behind this painting that was of interest to me. And I don't want to be stepping on your ground here, Trinita, on this. I mean, you're the art historian, but the fact that it was so large, I always wonder, you know, well, why did he choose this topic? And in actual fact, John Singer Sargent really had no knowledge of war. He knew nothing about the Army, but he did have I call him his sidekick, and that was Henry Tonks. And Henry and John Singer Sargent went to the front line in the summer of 1918. And Sargent had been asked to find subjects to paint the Anglo-American effort. The Yanks had just, or the Doughboys, pardon me, had just arrived at that time, and they were really coming into their height in the summer of 1918. So Sargent was commissioned to try and find subjects to show the British and the Americans working together. Well, when he and Tonks got out to the front line, they couldn't find this. They could see one off here and there, but they couldn't actually see large groups. And Sargent wanted a subject that was in a large group. And so they just kind of literally stumbled into this field dressing station. And I think for the first time, he really fully understood what was going on here, the wholeness, the horrific ghastliness of what this war was about, and he really captured it with this. I thought that there was an apocryphal story when Tonks and Sargent were out in the field right before they came upon these men. And there was a guardsman there, and he was a British guardsman, and he pulled his gun as he saw Sargent sketching his photograph, sketching the scene. And the guardsman said, "Halt! Who goes there?" And Sargent was so oblivious to what was going on around him, and he said his name. He said, "It's Sargent." And the guardsman said, "The hell you say? I know the sergeant, and he ain't you." So, and as it turned out, this painting actually was meant to be in what would be the new Hall of Remembrance. I believe it was in London. But things didn't work out that way, and so the Imperial War Museum in London became what would be the remembrance site, and therefore the painting ended up at the Imperial War Museum. So I hope I did justice to this.
And actually, let me just say that if anyone is interested in Richard Ormond's lecture, it is on our website. So he is the great-nephew of the artist, and he has a lot of personal insights into Sargent's career. All right. Here we have another, I think this is a really beautiful watercolor, again by Claggett Wilson. The title here is Underground Dressing Station. The flesh is the thing crucified, pale in the dirt and darkness. And this shows, as the title indicates, an underground dressing station where the artist himself was treated. So he was injured in the Battle of Belleau Wood. He was both wounded and gassed. And this is just you see the body of a soldier. The artist has cropped the heads of a few of the figures here, only leaving the head of the doctor who is treating the patient. But you can see that the injured soldier is represented as a crucified body. Ken, I think this is one you wanted to speak to.
Yeah. So let's see. Yeah. So again, this incredibly haunting title that that directs our attention directly to this kind of sacrificial imagery and the idea of the injured soldier as a body being sacrificed. Though ironically, it's also an anonymous body. It's a body with no head, no face. It's it's literally sort of unknowable and kind of in some ways reduced to the status of an object. And so there we see this sense of sacrifice as something that is both made really graphically clear, but that is also profoundly depersonalized. And I don't. Again, it's not necessarily. Actually, no. I'll say it is my business as an anthropologist to read too deeply into everything, and I would suggest that there's maybe some pretty significant ambivalence about the nature of war-related injury and sacrifice that's evoked by this image. And including in the sense that that with this invocation or evocation of crucifixion, there's also this sense of medicine as both a form of ministration or aid, but also as itself its own source of pain or continuing injury or punishment. So the idea that being kept alive in the midst of these circumstances might not actually have felt particularly good at that moment, or might have been a sort of furthering of the sacrifice that was begun with injury on the battlefield.
It almost honors the caregiver, doesn't it, really? There's so much emphasis not just on the body here, but on those that are giving the care. And I wonder if his experience, perhaps in Bill of Wood, may have contributed to his need to recognize those caregivers. But this, if it hasn't become clear already, I'm sure you will realize this, but this is a highly mechanized war, and it led to unprecedented injuries, particularly to the head and the chest. And I think that, it's just the terrible impact on the body here. But I sent this photograph to Trinita and asked her if she could pair it with this because of the recurrent crucifix theme, which the sacrificial lamb, this Christ-like motif theme goes through all of the First World War. But there's also this procession I thought was important, the procession of the wounded, the procession from the battlefield. First of all, you start out with the parades, you proceed to war, and then you get to war, and then you proceed to the battlefield. From the battlefield, you're processing across no man's land into battle. And then beyond that, you're either progressing, if you're lucky, you get carried off the battlefield, you're progressing to hospital to care, or the process is on to a grave and the funeral procession. So, there's some interesting parallels here. Most striking, though, I think, is just the vulnerability of man in the face of this mechanized warfare.
All right, so we have about 5 minutes left, and we have a lot more slides, so we need to kind of decide here what we want to do with the remainder of the time. Should we pick one or two more?
Yeah, I was going to say, shall we skip ahead to Horace Pippin?
Okay, Horace Pippin it is. Okay, yeah, let's go forward. All right, so the exhibition features 4 works by Horace Pippin. There are 3 oil paintings and then a memoir that's presented on an iPad so that you can flip through it. It's a digital file. But Horace Pippin was an African-American artist and soldier. He fought during World War I as part of the Harlem Hellfighters, which was the 369th Regiment. And I can have Ken and Lisa talk about this more, but African-American soldiers were segregated from their white counterparts. And we see, I think very poignantly on the right, a segregated barrack. And then on the left, we see kind of how valiant these African-American soldiers were and how key they were to defeating the Germans. So this is a painting called Starting Home, the Ending of the War. And you see Germans surrendering to these African-American soldiers.
Do you want to go first, Lisa? No, that's okay. So there's so many things that are fascinating about Horace Pippin as a figure and about this particular set of images, and so I'll try to confine myself to just a couple of them. One is just to observe that, as with the images of women being recruited into or depicted in relationship to the war effort, these images are a reminder that war was waged in the midst of a profoundly unequal society in which some bodies and injuries to some bodies mattered more than others. And that the hurting and the healing of those bodies took place in a profoundly unequal country. And it's, I think Pippin died in 1946, right? Is that right? And so at the time that he died, he still lived in a segregated country. And the U.S. didn't just fight World War I with a segregated army; they fought World War II with a segregated army. And veterans of not only African American veterans, not only of World War I, but also of World War II, were systematically excluded from many of the benefits that were extended to white veterans and that helped. That are conventionally understood as helping to sort of both rehabilitate and empower veterans themselves in the wake of war, but also reconstruct American society in the wake of war, and that the images we see here are part of not just the inclusion and participation of African Americans in the war effort, but also a testament to their systematic and continuing exclusion from those efforts and from the sort of the social good and recognition associated with them. So we've got the segregated barracks as just one kind of vivid example of that. And then just one other thing that I'll mention about it is the fact that unlike the Claggett Wilson images, these paintings by Pippin, he made them a couple of decades after the war. So Claggett Wilson, I think, made most of those paintings in 1919, 1920, and these are paintings that. That were made much later and so they're retrospective, they're reflective, but they were also a form of therapy. So as I understand it, Pippin actually took up painting as a form of physical therapy for his war-injured arm. He was injured by gunfire and had impaired mobility in his arm, and he took up painting as a source of healing for his body, but clearly it also served as a kind of a valuable medium for retrospection and for processing complicated and difficult memories. But one of the things that also means is that his injury is part of what constituted this art. It's part of what constituted our ability to see the war and his representation and recollection of it. And also, as it turns out, as I understand it, constituted him as an important artist in the late 1930s and early 40s when he kind of came to public prominence. And so one of the things we can think of there too is sort of the force of war as a kind of, at the same time as it is, literally at the same time as it is profoundly wounding and disabling, it is also a culturally generative force. Things come out of it. It makes us think things. It makes us see things in new ways, and it gives rise to new forms of expression. And again, the kinds of aesthetic expression that we see here both confront us with experiences that are very difficult to imagine, but also invite us to imagine those experiences and invite us to imagine our relationship to them in some very powerful ways, I think.
If you notice, I don't know if you can see them from where you're seated, but there were black soldiers in the lower portion of this painting, and you see the Germans are surrendering to them, but just as in life, in their true situation, the black soldiers actually disappear into the painting, which is, I think, kind of significant here. I understand he did this painting 300 times before he finally accepted the last version. And also, I think it's worth pointing out the frame around it. He actually made this frame, too, as like a tableau toward his therapy. And I came across this great quote by this artist, and he says, "I can never forget suffering, so I came home. I could never forget suffering, so I came home with all of it in my mind, and I paint from it today."
Yes, I think he also said that war brought art out of him. Yeah. So I'm afraid that is all of the time that we have. It is now 1 o'clock, and I do encourage you to go see the exhibition. For example, the Horace Pippin Starting Home, it's almost a sculpture as much as a painting because of the layers of paint that the artist applied. So I want to give my thanks to all of you and of course to Lisa and Ken for these incredible insights about the exhibition.